People will talk. Welcome back to the latest edition of our podcast. Today's a little bit different. We're doing an interview with Lindsay Moxham, who comes all the way from Australia. He's done teaching, he's a musician extraordinaire, and also a translator, and he's called Spain home for a number of years. Lindsay, very nice to have you here. Welcome to the podcast.
Great to see you. Great to see you.
And how long have you been here in Spain, Madrid?
Oh, I've been here since for about 22 years. 22 years, something like that. Yeah, but it's gone very quickly.
Really? Okay. And do you feel after so much time, you are more Spanish than Australian now, or do you still feel Australian?
Oh no, I still feel Australian. I mean, I think whatever nationality you are is really formed by the time you're a teenager. So that, I mean, if you're open-minded, you can go around the world and you can adapt to different places, and you can, learn languages or parts thereof, and different aspects of the places you're staying in. But I think there's this part that just remains what you are in those formative years, from those formative years,
And you're from Melbourne, that's correct?
No, I'm from Sydney. I wasn't born in Sydney, but I'm from Sydney. Yeah. Okay. So I grew up in Sydney.
And Australia now has so much going for it. Lots of culture. It's a magnet for people to, it's a place that people want to immigrate to. What was it like when you left? Was the story different? Because I know Irish people, we have Irish people in common who left Ireland at a time when there weren't so many prospects, and they came to Spain to really escape Ireland for different reasons. And now Ireland has a lot going for it. I mean, it's still difficult to live there in terms of living costs and stuff, but in terms of prospects and culture, I think it's quite a nice place. Was Australia quite different when you left 22 years ago?
Well, no, I left when I was 27, 28, and I went over to England, and I was there for like many years as well. So I guess a lot of my memories of Australia are from that period. So I was in London for many, many years, and from there I sort of did a lot more traveling around the world, not just around Asia, but in other places as well. So like London became my world or center for a long time, and then I came over to Spain sort of quite regularly, and as you know, Spain just gets under your skin. It just does, I mean, that doesn't mean you change your core attitudes or your core kind of view of the world, but it gets under your skin. There's a lot of great things about Spain, the lifestyle, the view of of the world, just all those little details, those little things. The only problem is Scrabble, of course. Scrabble is extremely difficult because you end up with just a row of vowels sometimes. So this is of course a very important international problem.
And if you go to the Basque Country, it's a series of X's, no?
Imagine that. Imagine that it's all vowels. It's like going to Poland. You just end up with consonants. It's the international Scrabble, Scrabble controversy that we all really must take more seriously.
Well, Spain have done a good job of burying this controversy. They've kept a lid on this, kept it inside the borders. And there's so much to kind of unpack here. So many interesting things about your experiences in England and traveling around Asia. But I guess one question I could ask you just before we get into that is, as an Irish person in Spain, they have a vague idea of Ireland's in terms of green fields and leprechauns and the typical stuff. And I guess they'd have the same idea of British people. And in Irish culture or British culture, Australians, we'd have an idea from Home and Away or Neighbours, for example. So when you tell a Spanish person, I'm Australian, What's the reaction? Is there a question? Do they register what that actually means?
Yeah, well, they always ask the same question and say the same thing. Everybody, they say, "Ay, que lejos." Oh, God, that's so far away, as if you didn't know already that it's the other side of the world. And then they look at you curiously and say, "What are you doing here?" And I'm never quite sure whether they're saying, like, "What are you doing here?" as in, like, why come here? What's so great about here? Or if there's a level of suspicion, is if, are you really running away from Australia?
Well, I think that's a fascinating point, because I love consuming other podcasts and books about the immigrant experience and when you're from a different country in another culture.
Oh, yeah.
And I follow a lot of people who live in Japan actually on YouTube, and I think the general consensus is that people, when you move to a country, there's always an expectation you're going to leave again. And it's like,
Yeah.
you're still here. Yeah, why are you still here? I think you'll always be an outsider, and that's not in a negative sense, because we were speaking before this about how amazing Spain is and how friendly it is, and we'll talk about that in a moment as well, of course. And it is a wonderful country for accepting outsiders. But like you said, you'll always be Australian. You mentioned because your formative years were in Australia. I would say, like for myself, my formative years were in Ireland as well. But I would say also that I will never be treated as a Spanish person, nor would I want to be honest with you. And I don't mean it in a negative way. You're outside, or you're different, but they can still be welcoming. But there's always just this idea, this barrier. I don't know if you found this in your experience as well.
Yeah, I think there are some things that Spanish people just know that you won't ever quite get. There are some things. I mean, there probably sort of a lot of examples, but it's a more kind of day-to-day example is like the Spanish goodbye. Now, you're laughing. The Spanish goodbye was kind of like mystifying for me, like the first few times. So, you're at a gig, or you're at a restaurant, and you come outside, and that's where the evening seems to begin, because people just start talking on the street and keep talking, and they say goodbye, and then they don't go. And they say goodbye, then they don't go. And that's one of the things, like, for example, that's really, really hard for, like Anglo-Saxon Celtic sort of cultures to kind of understand, because Australian goodbyes, see you, mate.
Well, you're
fucking out of there. Oh, can I swear, by the way?
Oh, you can swear, don't worry.
Okay.
No problem.
Yeah, so we're just out of there. Whereas Spanish people just really, like, not wallow, but they really enjoy this, like, final sort of goodbye, which I found extremely frustrating until I realized something. Now, there's a movie by Buñuel called The Exterminating Angel. It's a famous film.
Yeah,
you've seen it. Yeah, and it's where people who are in a room, in a house, in a party, and they, for some reason, they cannot leave because, well, it's kind of surreal, but I mean, it's almost like the social mores tell them not, or some indefinable thing will not let them leave. And then once I made that connection, I thought, oh right, okay, yeah, that's perfect.
That experience, this Spanish custom. Well, it's completely at odds with the Irish goodbye, which you might have heard of, where someone just disappears and they couldn't be bothered to say goodbye because it's just.
That's right. Yeah, this Spanish goodbye is at least we say goodbye. Just.
Yeah, Ireland's on the other extreme there, but as well, to get into, because I know you do so many interesting things. You're a man with many strings to your bow. As well. But we'll start with the inevitable, because you are a foreigner, and most foreigners end up being English teachers. And so I know for the last 10 years, this hasn't been your main activity. This has been, as you mentioned to me earlier, like 10% of your work. But you mentioned something to me really beautiful that really chimes with me as well, that as a teacher, of course, you bring your Australian or your Irish or American or British culture, but the students also give you so much as well. This has been really true in your experience. Could you kind of tell me that again, and explain, your experiences of being received and learning from your Spanish students?
Well, I mean, I think it's because you meet such a range of people. I mean, most of the time you're going to be in offices or whatever, so they're going to be probably pretty educated anyway, but you just met a whole range of people. I've met people who were some of the most brilliant people I've ever met, like so super intelligent that it was really hard sometimes to keep up with them. And other people who are just as dumb as I am, but I mean, for example, I met this one guy in Argentario, which was previously a bank, part of BBVA. And the man was super intelligent. He could talk backwards clearly. You imagine how hard that would be. He could talk backwards, clearly. He can do incredible mathematical sums in his head in an instant. But there was no autistic element to it at all. He was just a super brilliant and really friendly guy. I met these other group of people in Naya Brunio, and for me it was just a joy to go there because we'd sit down, the subject would start, and I would just sit there and lap it all up. Really, really fascinating conversation, and many other people that I've just kind of learned a lot of things, not just about Spain, but in general, because the conversation widens out. The more you know a person, the more the conversation widens out into lots of different aspects as well. I've had people who have been quite, I'm not saying emotional, but really use the English classes as a way of kind of expressing things that they can't normally express, like in different, like in work or home environment. It's almost like you're sitting there and you're a priest come psychiatrist to some people, and they just reveal things about themselves that, were quite unexpected. So, yeah, good.
Yeah, I've had that actually. Once a student came to me and said she had a work problem and she couldn't talk to her colleagues because it's a work problem.
Yeah.
She couldn't talk to her husband because he was like, it's fine. So she came into class and spoke to me for an hour. And I think it shows how welcoming and friendly Spanish people are. Your anecdotes there. Also, I think it shows the curious place I think English teaching has, as in most of us do it. It has these really interesting and wonderful aspects to it, where you do connect with people and you learn cultures and stuff. Yes, my impression is most people don't actually want to do it. So my question is, like, you've managed to kind of really enter other work opportunities. So do you feel, well, I guess it's a two-part question. Do you feel kind of grateful that you've been able to, even as much as you enjoy the teaching, that you've been able to kind of break out of it? And do you find that the reaction of other people when they find out that you don't do as much teaching, do you feel that they're kind of like, oh, good for you, this type of attitude?
I don't think anybody's ever said that, really. I don't think. I think the most important aspect to me, like the most important like attitude when you're in a class, is to realize that, and I know this sounds really obvious, but realize that they in this other language can express as much or more than you can in your own language, because we have this kind of tendency in all around the world to think that our language, therefore our point of view, etc., is able to express everything, and there's kind of a superiority complex, especially with English, because it's a dominant part of like world languages. And that's something you have to avoid.
I'm loath to interrupt you because I always see on YouTube comments, he never lets the person speak about other interviewers. But I'm kind of curious to ask you about that point in particular, because like as an Irish person, I don't feel a sense of superiority with the English language, because it's, I mean, even though it's a language I speak, obviously on a daily basis, I don't feel it's my language. And as much as I've met very nice English people, there's always a sensation that, well, you're not really speaking it properly if you're little old Paddy, and Australia, having, I guess, a different yet similar relationship to the country that birthed the language. Like my opinion today is that, for example, English doesn't really belong to any one country. But do you find because we all speak it and it's changed so much. But my question is, I mean, coming from Australia, do you think, like, is there an attitude that this is the Queen's language? This type of, is there? Okay,
I find a lot of people who, no, I'm talking about English people here. I'm not talking about Australians who are sort of, we sort of feel ourselves or felt ourselves to be kind of on the edge of a lot of things anyway. But I mean, I find a lot of English speakers think that their version of English is the correct version.
Okay.
And there's no arguing about it. I mean, and I agree with you. I think it's like every language. It just sort of spreads throughout the world, and people take it and use it as a tool as they want. For example, I remember this one guy was telling me. I said something was idyllic, and I said, and he said, no, it's idyllic. I went, not where I come from.
Well, that's
where I come from.
That's an interesting point, because like pronunciation in Spanish is so important, right? But I always tell my students, like, it doesn't matter in much in English. So it's idyllic, make yourself happy. You know, sorry, I cut across you again. I must rein that in for the rest of this interview. Sorry, Lindsay, you were saying about this idyllic situation.
Yeah, I'm just kind of saying that it's a tool. It's almost like somebody saying, well, you don't speak Latin like that when you're talking about somebody. Well, the Roman Empire has been, dead for 1600 years. So there's no such thing as, Romance languages. Okay, how can I say this? Romance languages come from Latin. That doesn't mean that's the only way that they can ever be used. So English, for example, is from England. Okay, fine. It's from the British Isles, but it's spread throughout the world in greater numbers.
Well, from Britain rather than the British Isles, I would say, because.
Well, yeah. Well,
I mean, because what I would say, what I would say for that though, is like I don't always tell my students if it comes up. Well, Latinos speak Spanish for the same reason we speak English, and that's very important to keep in mind as well, like the origin of the language into our country as well. It's for that reason, I don't see it as an Irish product, or I don't feel a sense of superiority with the English language because of that, because the British Isles for me also, which is a separate point, we won't get lost in this because this is about you and your music, and we'll talk about all those wonderful things as well. But it's like Narnia, or it's one of these places that doesn't really exist. It's a construct for people who believe, present company excluded, of course, but it's a construct invented by people who believe in empire and all those things, which I think would have its roots in people as well who believe that their version of the language is superior to other forms. But there's actually evidence to show that second speakers speak English better and in a more effective way than native speakers do. So because they don't use colloquial language, they make pauses and they try and make sure that the other person understands them. Three things that native speakers don't do. So in fact, there's no evidence to suggest that the native version of a language or any particular language is better than another, of course, but there is evidence to suggest that a second language learner is more effective in the business context at speaking English than a native speaker. So
they get to the point.
Yeah, they get to the point.
And they also don't necessarily try to impress with all the little nooks and crannies of the language and cultural references and all that. So I mean, as like a short-term effective tool, I agree. Another thing too, I think is important, is that I think native speakers, wherever they come from in the world, when they talk to somebody who's speaking a second language, they have to learn how to speak to those people. I mean, if you and I can probably, like speak 3 times as fast and with all these different references. Okay, but when you're talking to somebody whose second language is English, you have to kind of relearn the process. I think you have to make sure that you're understood, and the idea is not to dominate the person or try to impress that person, but create effective contact with them. So you don't necessarily have to use phrasal verbs. You don't necessarily have to use like words that you remember from Chaucer or something like that, So you have to use words that you think they will understand, risking occasionally a bit of extension, but try to reach some sort of common ground. Do you know what I mean?
No, of course. And I think what's fascinating as well, coming from your perspective, because this is about communication and communicating, and you're so immersed in this world, because apart from your experiences of teaching, and I understand completely what you mean, and I agree completely. But not only do you see it from this perspective, you see it from the perspective of a translator, because you translate artistic things as well, which is another form of expression, TV, and film. And also you're a singer in a band, the Angry Saints. And that's another form of communication as well. So, I mean, even though we mentioned earlier, like maybe 10% of your working life revolves around teaching, but primarily your working life is about kind of understanding communication and how to do it more effectively. So, and so taking it in parts, I guess, as a translator as well, like, is it the same process when you mentioned talking to a student and using some words and then maybe venturing another word that's more complicated to test the waters, for example? But is your approach to translating like a little bit different, or is it the same philosophy but just with different tools?
Kind of the same philosophy. It does change a little bit if you're translating a script, which I've done like many. A script, you can be more, you can be closer to the original, because it's something that is to be read by somebody who knows the language very well. But if you, so you can be very, very accurate. But if you're talking about subtitles, it's a different medium in a way, because you're talking about an audio-visual medium in another language, and then you have to kind of communicate what is being said in a short period of time.
Okay.
And not only in a short period of time, but also, so that the person has enough time to look at the image and then relate the text underneath to the image. So there's a lot of summarizing to do. It's like a balancing act between being as accurate as possible, but also summarizing enough and clearly so that the person has time to read it and then enjoy the visual aspect as well. That's really hard to do. Sometimes it's much harder than scripts. Scripts are more or less, you can just follow what the person is communicating and then translate it literally. But subtitles are different. Sometimes they're different.
You're living your Shakespeare moments. Excuse me. You're living your Shakespeare moments, which is brevity is wit.
Yeah.
No, you have to condense it in
such a brevity is soul of wit. That's right. Yeah. Actually, I saw a version of Hamlet. Translate, and I saw it in Spain with the Spanish subtitles. And to be quite honest, the Spanish subtitles were much easier to understand than Shakespeare. And that was kind of a revelation to me. It's like, oh yes, we're not trying to say every single word exactly the same, because it's not people don't go to the movies or watch television to like read a novel underneath the action.
Yeah,
they go there to get the idea and have a fuller experience.
So it's like a soliloquy, but then the subtitles are, I feel guilty. My conscience is bothering me. Kind of condensed.
Yeah, Hamlet was saying, geez, should I top myself off or not?
Yeah. To be your,
I mean,
yeah, ... And have you been part of wonderful stories? I guess. I mean, have there been some movies or TV shows that you've been a part of as a translator with the script, or the subtitles, and they've been wonderful productions? Basically, have you been lucky enough to say that?
Yeah. This is a bit risky here. I'd say 8 out of 10 things that I have to translate are just garbage.
Okay, fair enough.
But they're just garbage. As in, 8 out of 10 things that are produced in Australia and America, 80% of it is just filler, and it's not good at all. But when you get that 20% where people have made like a greater effort, or they're kind of less influenced by the money aspect, and the kind of commercial pressure and all that, when it's really done well, I've seen some fantastic things here.
Wow.
Really have.
That's a great. Sorry, please continue, Lindsay. Yeah. I was cutting across you there again.
But I'm just trying to be honest about this, and the fact that most of the things that you have to work with are not good.
you raise an
Something you have
interesting,
to accept.
but you raise a great point there though, because like I have friends, and also it's like it's a delicate topic, no, because you're talking about production companies and
Yep.
but I have a friend who believes like commercial pressures really ruin productions, and obviously it makes sense because at the end of the day, a lot of these things are businesses and they have to be profitable. But when the handbrake's taken off on a financial aspect, then stories can soar. Sounds very cliched, but very often
No,
best work is done when money isn't so much of an issue, but a lot of things are a safe pair of hands, and they're done according to a formula. And there's a lot of sense to why that happens, but it's just a pity. But I get a sense from what you said, and also what he's told me before. A lot of good things are kind of lost because of that. And speaking of kind of projects, for example, let's talk about your wonderful band, Angry Saints. It's a fabulous. I love the vibe of the bands. It's an international band. You've people from all over the world as well. So. So I guess you have different voices contributing, and it's a very unique band in that sense because you have these kind of voices from different corners of the world, and all kind of unifies in this kind of amazing and concrete way. That's what you find, no?
Well, the other guitar player and drummer, Rick and Carolina, have been friends since childhood. So they know each other very, very well, and they're more in the kind of like pop punk kind of vein, I guess, in a way, more or less than that. And Dave Robinson, the bass player, also a songwriter as well. He's from the Midlands in England. He has like his own like view of music and his own approaches. A lot of Hawkwind. I know he'd like me to say he's a huge Hawkwind fan and kind of a metal fan, but he's got a very, very wide sort of range of music that he listens to as well. And so that's that. And I don't know, I'm a mess. I've listened to like so many different sorts of music. I don't know where I am anymore, really, because I kind of like a lot of different sort of musics that people don't like, and electronic music concrete, world music, and experimental stuff, as well as like rock, obviously rock as well. So that's true. There's a whole range of ideas going through there. But like you're saying before about films and television having limitations, financial limitations, sometimes it's good to have limitations on what you do as well, playing music. So I mean, if you want to, you could produce an album with 17 different styles if you want, but that's kind of chaotic, and it doesn't really like press like a proper seal on what you're doing at this moment. So it's good to have those parameters, I guess.
Do you feel sorry for artists, because sometimes it can be a case of damned if you do and damned if you don't? If you never change your style, it's a complaint, and then if you change it, some of the fans like, I don't want to go with them on this new journey. So it's complex to kind of manage your evolution, I guess, as a band and your sounds. Do you feel that pressure ever, or do you feel free to kind of go in any direction you want?
Well, it's not much pressure because we're not that big. We just, a band in Madrid that gigged around fairly regularly until the pandemic. But so there's not really any pressure to do that. But I mean, I've talked about this with Dave quite a lot. Is that there are parameters which are kind of good. You kind of concentrate within your limitations. But also, I really think that there are no rules that you have to obey. I mean, I'm talking about stylistic rules you don't have to obey. There are musical rules that are there to be broken, I think. So, I mean, there are rules and things that, in the sense that some things sound good and some things sound bad. So some things sound bad, but in terms of rules of what you can and can't do, I don't feel like that at all. I don't feel any limitations.
Okay, very interesting. And you mentioned the gigging. I mean, there's two things here. You were, from what I understand, you were recording an album when the pandemic hit.
The second one, yeah.
Second
The
one.
second one after the pandemic hit, and so that was made a little more restricted, I suppose, but that seemed to be, it was okay.
Do you miss gigging as well in bars?
Yeah, very much so. Very much so. We did a gig last Sunday down in Carabanchel, and that was fun. That was fun, but it had been 18 months since we played live, so we were all kind of a bit nervous. But I mean, up to that 18-month period beforehand, we'd done, I mean, about 15 gigs here in Madrid and in Valencia and in places. So we kind of honed things down pretty well.
What I like about, because you mentioned, you're a band in Madrid, but you do have a presence, you do have a following for sure. And I've seen some of your videos that have a very, it's an amazing art style in the videos, and there's like professional production there as well. So, so I mean, you kind of are known, no, on the scene, and you have your fans, and you are.
Spotify's been pretty good too, because we've got sort of cumulatively about 70,000 hits on Spotify, which is, pleasant surprise. That's good.
That's great.
That's just for the second record. The first record, I can't remember how many we got, but that's doing very, very well. But I've got to say, with Rick and Carolina, Rick is the one who's like responsible for like getting the gigs. He's a good guy for like liaison with people. He knows people around and about too, and he's much more I don't know, sociable than I am.
Everybody needs a fixer in their initiative.
Yeah, no, he does a good job. We've done a lot of gigs, and we've done a lot of gigs in sort of medium-sized places, which are pretty good too. So that runs very smoothly. Yeah.
And we spoke about. Sorry, Lindsay. Yes, please continue.
I was going to say, and Carolina,
is
sort of like a multi-talented person. She does lots and lots of different things, but she is more in charge of the artwork and the videos. We all have input into what we like, what we don't, some ideas and all that. But basically, she's in charge of that on the both discs, and on the videos as well. She just sort of bangs away at them at home as well. So all credit to her in that regard.
And your first album, I mean, when you recorded your first album, was this a life-changing moment? Was it like a dream fulfilled? How did you feel?
Oh no, I've recorded albums before. So I mean, I've done lots of recordings in Australia and in London and here before as well. So it wasn't like a new experience or something like that, but it came together. No, it was good. It came together really well. And the guy that produced it, called Chifley, was very amenable to suggestions, and incredibly hard worker, like incredible powers of concentration, and an excellent ear for music as well. So he made it easy for us to kind of like produce it fairly quickly. The first one we recorded in about 4 days, I think. 4.5 days. Brilliant. So yeah, and the second one as well was about that much too. Which I don't know if you about this, but that's really fast. It's not Captain Beefheart and Troutmouse Replica recorded in 4.5 hours. It's not that, because not in the same league. But that's pretty fast, and that's all credit to him, really, and the preparation.
Well, it's been a fascinating journey with you. I'll ask you just one more question, because I know we're recording in the weekends, and I don't want to take up too much of your time. But with the year ahead, things seem to be opening up with COVID. There's some kind of hope and optimism. Just generally speaking, what are your kind of hopes for the next year? Record another album, do more gigs, whatever it could be.
Well, the bass player Dave and Rick, they basically do the pre-recording, like the pre-production. Okay, so we normally just produce some demos first, give them to Chipley, and he kind of gets a good idea for what we're on about, and then that, so it just basically facilitates the last part of the process. And we've almost finished doing that for the third disc now.
Brilliant.
And we've got enough for another 2, maybe 3 discs, enough material for another 2, maybe 3 discs as well. So, and we're constantly writing new stuff too. So, I mean, that's kind of like an endless path in a way. And as far as gigs go, yeah, I mean, once things open up, we're looking forward to getting out and playing fairly regularly. Yeah, because it's fun,
Lindsay, one thing I haven't asked you about is your Irish heritage, because we were discussing this as well before we were recording the podcast. Moxham, your surname isn't a typically sounding Irish name, but I can't remember if your name has a link to Ireland, but even if it doesn't, you certainly do, and you have quite a story to tell about that as well. So where can you start with this?
The name Moxham, the name Moxham sort of is a Cornish name, apparently, way back. But the Moxham family is like just totally Irish for a long period of time. So, I mean, they're from, I believe, County Wicklow. And yeah, that's on my father's side. My mother's side is O'Meara, which is, a Limerick name, but they weren't from Limerick. They were from, I think, Northern Ireland. Well, obviously Northern Ireland is Ireland. Yeah, they were from the north, apparently. I think they were the sort of, even though it's more an Irish-sounding name, they were the Protestant side of the family. Some sort of link with an archbishop or something like that goes around. I don't know, something like that.
Yeah.
In Ulster. And my father's side of the family was from County Wicklow, and they came to Australia independently. The 2 Irish lines came in independently. One from immigration late 19th century, but my father's side as a convict in 1833, 1834, which was the peak year of transportation to Australia. It was it did sort of level off at that period and then obviously go down. I think the last one was 1848 or something like that. Yeah, but he was sent out to Australia for 7 years for forgery.
Wow.
And this was actually quite common because, it wasn't, I mean, obviously there were a certain number of people who were bad criminals, a certain number of people who were simply just, like small-time thieves, and another sort of more, I guess you could call it middle-class crime, but it wasn't really, because forgery was quite common, because they would be forging banknotes and be forging bonds and things like that. So it wasn't an uncommon crime at all. But that was the idea. So yeah.
Wow. And how much have you been able to explore this? Have you ever gone to an archive or some type of museum that shades more like?
I actually found out about it quite by accident. When my father died, we were looking through some papers, and there was sort of a rumor in the family, that maybe there might be a convict connection, but no. And then suddenly turned over a piece of paper, and there it was, the record of his transportation in 1833, arriving in 1834. Because it's a long trip.
And after he comes, because sometimes the Irish people in Australia even got involved in rebellions. Other people were in prison and then they set up businesses afterwards. There's so many different stories there. How much of this guy's life do you know of in Australia?
Virtually nothing.
Really? Mm-hmm.
Virtually nothing. And I think the reason for that is that it was referred to for a long time as the stain. Because if you were sent to Australia and you were a convict, most people, for up until the 50s and 60s, even the 70s, people didn't talk about it because it was like the stain, or in other words, like as if there was something wrong with your character. If you had some people in the past who were convicts, so it wasn't discussed. Subsequently, people sort of started to think, well, okay, it's part of our heritage, and it's almost like we should talk about it.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, I think nowadays people embrace these stories because, on
Yes.
one hand,
Yeah.
he's probably forging, you can imagine, maybe because of poverty, sent
Mm.
by an oppressive regime anyway, and then sent
Yeah.
to exile. So people kind of like can embrace these stories more and more now, because it's
Yeah.
about almost like identity politics in a way, I guess. Not, maybe that sounds strange, but I mean, what I mean is like that people can identify with this and see it as heroic, or they can see it as something that's
Mm.
not shameful. They can
Sure.
see it something as the human story, in this type of a guy caught up maybe in bigger forces than himself.
Sure.
So I think, yeah, generally speaking, we're in this moment now in the 21st century.
Mm.
But I think it's quite kind of curious as well, because like Australia, we always associate countries with certain things, and the fact that a lot of convicts were sent to Australia isn't
Mm.
exactly a secret. So is it
Sure.
is it a case of maybe cognitive dissonance, that on a global sense, yes, we know convicts were sent to Australia, but if it's our
Mm.
family, we didn't want to talk about it. Was there that kind of disconnect there as well?
It was. It was. It was definitely the attitude that people had. It's like, well, you just didn't talk about, your background in a way. I mean, it's the idea about. I think the idea about identity politics is that identity politics for me means that you are using your identity to separate yourself and present something to people about how you think you should be seen and how
Hmm.
much power you should have, etc., etc. Which I don't really believe in. It should be tabula rasa, really. But the other idea, I mean, it's also just historically interesting to know about your past and know about, what forces made your country the way it is, and the way it was, and the way it is. So I think historically interesting, but I don't really believe in the idea of, like, you know, displaying your identity. For example, I mean, I know that I have Irish background, Irish blood, and all that sort of stuff, but I don't feel Irish because I'm not. You know.
So if we look at another country that has a history of
Mm-hmm.
immigration like America,
Yeah.
America's the country of the hyphen, the Italian American, the Irish American. So generally speaking, maybe in Australia, that hyphen doesn't exist. Would
Yeah.
that be fair to say?
People don't use that very much. I've never heard anybody in any sort of like common way use that. I mean, so if you called yourself Chinese Australian, for example, people will probably look at you funny, going, "Well, you're Australian. You're not Chinese Australian." Yes, it's almost like, why can't you accept that there are different people? Like, it doesn't matter where you come from. You're here now. And I mean, if you're talking about what your outlook or identity is, it really happens when you're child and teenager. That's where you really are formed. So you can sort of take any child of any race, background, whatever, and put them in a place during that period, and that kind of ends up being their identity in a way.
It's I think behind it, it seems like it's a very liberal, or not to put a political ideology on it, but it's very open,
Mm-hmm.
maybe kind of in a more neutral way. It's more open philosophy, because everybody's Australian, regardless of where you come from, regardless what you look like, you are Australian. So it's kind of an open, welcoming stance to
Mm-hmm.
remove that hyphen. Would that be a fair way
In, in
of looking
general,
at that?
in general, it is, or it should be. I mean, we've got our people in Australia too who are extremely high-bound and closed-minded as well. There's always a section of any culture that's like that. But in general, I mean, the way I was brought up with the attitude was not individualistic, and the American idea of the obsession with the individual and freedom in inverted commas, but egalitarian.
So do you think, actually, that's an
Which I
interesting
think is a
word?
different. There's a difference there, I think, in your attitude.
If the American, because we do have stories of Americans coming back to the old sod, in Ireland, and they come back to where their great great grandfather came back or came from, and they can be very
Mm-hmm.
emotional. But even because we discussed music in this podcast, Kurt Cobain apparently went to Cork. Well, he wasn't Cork for sure, but he felt really emotional walking around the streets, crying almost, because
Mm-hmm.
he had seemingly some Irish connection. Do you attribute that to a sense of American individualism, that this is just all bolstering a sense of identity for the self? And in Australia, it's not as individualistic as America, so that's why we don't see this kind of connection with where we come from it's not as strong as it is for maybe an average American person, maybe.
Right. I think the problem here is it's a temptation to mythologize your own background too much, and that, to me, that smacks of despair and desperation a little bit. As if, I'm searching so much for my identity. You find somebody like in Boston, and they say, "Yeah, I'm Irish," and you go, "What the fuck are you talking about?" Your family's been here in some possibly only 100 years, but maybe 300 years. How could that actually make you Irish? Identifying your history and background is great, but I mean, it's almost like the concept of stolen valor.
Yeah, I understand
that idea. This is almost like stolen nationality and stolen identity. Just accept who you are. Just accept who you are. You're a guy from Boston. Your name's Barry. Just because your name's Barry Sullivan doesn't mean that you're an Irish person. Irish people know what it's like to be Irish. Australian people know what it's like to be Australian. And New Zealanders know what it's like to be New Zealanders. So it's not just. This
is fascinating because I think as well, the stolen past, mythologizing the past, and not being in the present. You could look at it like this as well. Like, so right now, speaking about in the moments of our life as it is now, in the moment and in the present, do you have a strong attachment to identity, either as an Australian or with something else, as a musician or as a teacher, or what are your feelings on identifying yourself with X, Y, or Z? Leaving aside the past, but something in the present moments.
I don't.
Okay, interesting.
No, absolutely not. I mean, for one thing, I've always been very suspicious of this idea of your nationality as having some sort of halo around it. This is the worst temptation about it. I don't care where it is, Scottish, Irish, Myanmar, whatever, as if the place that you are born makes you somehow have this aura.
Yeah.
And this kind of like transcendence that you can take through the world. And then, I will show you what I'm like. I am like this, I mean, there were certain characteristic traits of people in certain places at certain times, and that's great. And if you identify that, not identify with, but if you kind of identify that and understand it, it's beneficial. For example, I know there are some sort of characteristic things about Australians that I've kind of got. In a way, I know that they're just there because of the way I was brought up, the period I was brought up, and maybe even location within that geographical area. So you identify it and you understand it. But I think it's very dangerous to attach yourself too strongly to that. I remember speaking to this Chilean guy. I used to live in Chile, and he was saying that he was suspicious of nationalism, but I think he said something like warm about patriotism, which is kind of two different. One thing is you can like where you come from, you can try to understand where you come from, and to a certain degree, you understand the benefits and the detrimental things of that, like circumstance as well. But the next step is thinking it makes you so different from other people. You don't want to go down that road.
Definitely not. No, of course, there's a lot of excesses, and if you take nationalism to its ugliest extent or extreme, it's a very bad place. But could you say though that this is another type of mythology as well? That if we think that there are no barriers or there's no differences, we're not living in the world as it is, perhaps,
But there are differences. There are differences, and I think you can accept differences and try to understand the reasons why. Without necessarily thinking that these are like permanent and immutable. For example, how would you describe like a Japanese person, for example? Think about the Japanese and Japanese psychology. And there were so many factors that make up their psychology, and they do have a different psychology to other people in the world. They do. They have ideas of perfection, the ideas of permanence, to a certain degree, a certain xenophobia as well. But I mean, that's common with everybody. It's common, I don't mean that so much. But
Yeah.
and then the most interesting thing to me is, how did that happen? Is it because of isolation? Is it because of history, location related to other countries and all that? And you can try to work out the reasons for some characteristic traits of people and identify them and accept them for what they are.
I
Know
guess
what I mean?
Yeah, I understand. I guess I'll ask you one more question about this. I'm interested as well to know, like, if you look in the mirror, in the metaphysical sense, like,
hopefully. I try not to in the physical sense.
So, the question of, like, who am I? And I understand a lot of people don't want to link themselves to a certain identity, whether it be nationalism or something else. And I completely get that. And that's perfectly valid. But I guess my question would be, in that maybe void or the absence of that, what fills that space that kind of determines who you are and how you feel about yourself, or how you relate who you are to the rest of the world? Do you understand what I'm trying? Like, do you know what I mean?
Do. I'm more interested and wonder more about why there is this need. What is the need to identify yourself and to fill that space? So then you have to ask, what is that space?
But isn't it inevitable though? No, because we are like something. And this gets, I guess, a bit more abstract, but we are something in a space, so we kind of have to relate ourselves to it, no?
I think it just sort of comes naturally. I think that what the need to fill that space with an identity shows the most important part about that is that there is a certain hollowness there that you want to fill, and that's what makes me a little suspicious. That's all. But I mean, we have our identities.
To fill that, I mean, is it a question of meditation or some kind of philosophy as a society?
I haven't got time for meditation.
I know you're a very busy man, but I guess in a general sense, is it a case of, like, as a society, we probably need to lean more into understanding philosophy or psychology or going there, or understanding meditation? Because I think more people are open to that nowadays compared to the past. So it seems like there is excuse me, there seems to be a void in society as a whole. So to fill that, we need to kind of look into other things. No, my voice is breaking. I'm finally becoming a man. But so does that make sense as well? What I'm trying to ask as well?
You think people are much more inclined to actually to look a bit deeper into the idea of what existence is, and what who are we as individuals, etc. I mean, possibly. I think it's something that we've always felt in a way. I'm not sure. One thing I'm worried about too is the idea of looking into the past and even the near past and seeing it as so different. For example, I mean, I hear a lot of people say that what the attitudes were in the 80s. People thought like this in the 90s, and let us not think about the 70s or before. And I think the idea, of course, people's, the general zeitgeist changes over a period of time, but I think a lot of times people just ignore the fact that there are continuities. For example, attitudes towards racism, for example. A lot of people say, well, people were so racist in the 80s. And you think, hang on, I'm old enough to be, in the 80s, kind of when I grew up in a way. And there were some, of course, but in general, no, not at all. I mean, it's telling a lie about the past to make the present seem more progressive in a way and more advanced. You got to be very careful about that. I mean, for example, if you read some people's writings in the 1920s, 1930s, obviously a lot of people were racist at the time.
Yeah.
Obviously, the amount of racism, sexism, and imperialist concepts and all that were much, much higher at the time. But there were always people who were fighting against that, So you can't just kind of have a blanket opinion about it.
I completely agree. I think that's totally true. And also, as if you look at history and you read accounts from people, you realize how modern they can sound as well, and that's including reading ancient texts. And I've come to the conclusion that humans haven't fundamentally changed over the course of history. As you mentioned, the zeitgeist changes and things, attitudes can change, but the fundamental business of being human, I don't think has changed too much over the millennia. And I know as well, for example, you are somebody who has a deep interest in politics, particularly American politics as well.
History courses.
More history, okay, and
It's fascinating.
Yeah, where's that love come from?
Because my grandmother gave me a book when I was 10, about 10 years old, which was just like a basic history of the United States, which I've still got. It's right there. Still got there, and it's called Upton Sinclair. Yeah, and it was a fascinating book. So from there, I just got more and more interested in it. And read a lot of things about it. Why American history? Probably because, like, as an Australian, kid growing up, America was kind of like, wow, it's so big and so powerful and so, important in the world at the time. So that was like the general orientation that we kind of had. And from there, it was one of these countries that, one of the very few countries that sort of did have a new beginning. France, for example, had a French Revolution, but it ended up not really being a new beginning after about 50 years, or even after about 20 years, really. But the American idea was a very, very new thing. People can be cynical about the founding fathers and their Constitution, Bill of Rights, and all that, but it was a pretty important break.
Yeah.
For that period, and the people that put it all together, even though they were just rich guys with slaves, a lot of them, they were, genuinely, it seems, trying to think of a new way to run a society. Whether it worked out, well, that's greatly open to interpretation. But the initial stage was like a fascinating leap forward, copied by a lot of other countries as well. So off to a good start. Went a bit haywire, and there was slavery, and etc. But it was a fascinating break, and from there on, it's a great thing to follow.
I imagine that the last few years with the Trump presidency and everything as well has been historical, because it's going to be remembered in the future for everything attached to it. You must have been glued to that as well. Every unfolding crisis, of which there are many.
I think everyone was, really, wasn't there?
Yeah,
because it wasn't like the period of like inaction but stability, of the Obama years, and the gross stupidity of the Bush and previous and Clinton and Reagan. That whole period, which was terribly damaging, but. The Obama period had a sort of a hopefulness to it, which was not satisfying, I don't think. In the sum of what happened over that period, didn't really live up to the hopes that people had. But the Trump thing was sort of almost like a what the hell moment, and nobody's looking out for us. Let's just see what we can do. So they just choose this man who was just clearly a con man.
And a treasonous con man, no? Especially according to latest reports.
Yeah, he's treasonous. He's sort of a criminal, really. But it depends on if you see con men as criminals. But he's broken tons of laws, and he should be in jail, really.
He's a strange man, because even reading in examinations into his family life, his relationship with his children as well, it's so transactional that he'll support his children as long as they have some use for him, and vice versa as well, because now they're saying Ivanka is gearing up to dump him because he's political baggage that she doesn't need if she wants to continue her political career or her post-Trump presidency career at the very least. And it's such a cold, dynamic environment that he inhabits. It's a strange, joyless world, and also you might have heard this as well, like he doesn't consume any culture of any kind, but even if he's watching a Steven Seagal movie, he fast forwards to the fighting parts, and then he skips all the dialogue scenes. And if you can't even just have the concentration to consume this story in its entirety, I cannot imagine what the interior worlds of this man must be like.
The key word with him really is narcissistic. He's a narcissist.
Yeah.
I mean, clinically, he's clinically a narcissist. So his whole worldview is centered around one person in the world. One person in the world is him. So even his family, other people, etc., they don't really count. And so interesting you said the word not a joyful experience this man is having in life, because I think that's probably what happens a lot with narcissists. It's all about them. So if it's not satisfying your particular ego or your particular sort of like desire at the time, it's either wrong or boring. This is a joyless existence. It really is. It also influences what you do, but also what you can do. Because if you have only only a narcissistic viewpoint of the world, then you know what to do in certain situations. And this is one of the little kind of skills he's got. He knows what to do because it's me. What do I do? He doesn't think things through, of course. He just thinks, me, I'll do this. Me, I'll do this. It's a very like knee-jerk reaction. So, and that appears to be strong. It's not strong. It's just simply really utterly self-centered.
And there's one other aspect of politics I wanted to ask you about as well, because you have mentioned to me that when you were younger, you had an interest in anarchism
Still do.
And you still do.
Oh yeah, fascinating.
So for the uninitiated, how would you explain this philosophy?
I think it's just the idea of self-reliance, but that doesn't necessarily mean pure and utter individualism. The one thing you've got to be careful with is just with words and your reactions to them, because when someone hears the word anarchist and there's here's the word anarchist, and they think, okay, this means everybody running through the streets and killing each other because there are no rules.
Yeah,
that's one kind of viewpoint. But if you read any of the anarchist writers and philosophers too, because it is a philosophy, this is not what they advocate. They're not advocating irresponsibility at all. Quite the opposite.
We mentioned earlier again, but this is off the podcast, but Russell Brand is also a subscriber to this belief, and he envisages a world where there's global villages and everybody.
Yeah, is Russell Brand you're talking about?
Russell Brand, yeah.
Yeah.
And this is essentially, I mean, would it be too crude to say that overall this is a rejection of globalization? And
I think it probably is, but it sort of has this kind of Jeffersonian overtones, because Jefferson had the idea of, a nation of homesteaders, basically. All these individual farmers, self-reliant, and all that. This is good and may work in some circumstances, but you've got to look about where you are in history as well. What institutions have we built up? Really, but more than institutions, because they can be changed, believe it or not. What circumstances, what economic circumstances, and what interactions we have at this time in history. So you can't just say, well, let's just all go back and live in villages. How does that work?
So
it's not even necessary. There are historical precedents for large cities evolving into fairly anarcho kind of concepts in a way. The free medieval free towns and all that, guilds, Barcelona in the 30s. Few examples, but they do exist, of a well-organized and large body of people coexisting around those principles. It doesn't have to be a little village.
Yeah. And for example, Barcelona 30s, obviously that was ended by the Civil War. Those medieval free cities, how long did they last for?
Well, the medieval free cities lasted a bit longer, but obviously the running of Barcelona generally on anarcho-syndicalist principles did not last long, because they lost the war. And And then you've got to look at the idea. Why was the war lost? Why did the war start? Why was the war lost? What are the ramifications after that as well? I mean, one of the really, the quotes, and it's a really common quote, about history, is that Zhou Enlai was asked about what he thought were the effects of the French Revolution. And he said, it's too soon to tell.
Oh, yeah, yes,
and it's as you know, it's a really well-known thing. I think it was Zhou Enlai. And it's almost like saying, you can't really talk about any point in history without context. And not even that, the context before that. And not even just the political and social context, but other factors as well. What were people undergoing a plague at the time? Had there been invasions before that had traumatized people? What was the climate like, even? Even factors like that. So there are so many factors that influence any point in history that it's frustrating but fascinating. Do you know what I mean?
I understand completely, and I can see why it's such a compelling philosophy as well. I can tell though that, for example, you look at Spain and how PSOE, the socialists, are seen by their far right as being like so communist. I mean, obviously
they're not even socialists, really.
Well, that's the thing. Anybody with a brain would know, And then you look at like things like Obamacare in America being seen as some kind of red socialist kind of plague as well. So anything that's like not even that left wing is painted as extreme socialism or communism.
That's right.
Anarchism has a snowball's chance in hell, no, of being on the ballot and being successful. Or am I being too pessimistic with that? Because it just seems like people.
Well, I think it's what we were saying at the beginning about people's reaction to words.
Okay.
They hear a word and they panic. Like Americans, if you can say socialist in the United States, and a certain, less and less so now, but a certain sector of the population, it's just their just head's going to fucking explode because they think that means Soviet Russia and gulags and all that. Just simply the basic, that thread of an idea is going to automatically. It's childish. It really is. It's childish attitude to react to a single word and
with hysteria, basically.
And assume things and be hysterical. So when people say that the PSOE is, they're socialists and they're so, you think you're not even paying attention, to what the real things are. I mean, you could say the word fascism as well. Okay, most people are going to have a bad reaction to it, but that's kind of an overused word as well. And overly used and badly used, like for anybody who's slightly right wing or slightly conservative, to call them fascist is just simply wrong.
It's an abuse of the term.
But that happens. So that happens too much as well.
So the final question I'll ask you is, I guess it's a very broad question, but how do you envisage this being put into practice in a modern world then? What would it look like if it was implemented successfully?
Yeah, I know that's the idea. It's always the argument comes back as this. Well, unless it's not going to be practical. And
that's not what I'm asking you. I just want to hear your thoughts.
But you're saying how would it go? Like the line of inquiry is how would that come about? And I think it's more like you've got to treat it as an objective and ballast on the ship.
Mm-hmm.
And what I mean by that is we're all going through history with our past and hopes for the future. And if you have something that on your ship that balances this as ballast and keeps you kind of steady, then maybe you might make better decisions in the future. In other words, I don't see this anarchism as this thing. Well, tomorrow morning we're going to have anarchism and everybody's free, blah, blah, blah. No, it's just, for me, it's more like as the ship goes along, you have this thing that balances it. In other words, authoritarianism is not necessarily the best way. Mm-hmm. And if you use, the idea of reducing hierarchies and reducing the force that tells people what to do. This is the best objective. So it's kind of, I see it like that. It's more like, okay, this is the aim that we should be heading for, the objective we should be heading for. It's not necessarily going to work in every situation or immediately, but it is a good kind of utopia, to regain that word as a good thing.
And I agree with that completely. I think we do need those ideals to fall short of, but by falling short of them, we've made some progress. No?
Yeah, I mean, there's a really good quote from an anarchist writer called Rudolf Rocker, who I'm quite fond of, who was late 19th, early 20th century, and he said that in a criticism of communism, as in statist, communism, that there's a big difference between the people's will and the people's stick. And what he meant by that is like, people can have certain ideals that they are going for, and this is what the people's will is. And the other thing is the people's stick. In other words, having something that is by the tyranny of the majority, basically, is being forced by people, on people as well. It's almost like political self-harm. Okay. That's what I think. You know what I mean?
Yeah. That's very interesting. I love the writers you're quoting. I'm sure if anybody's listening to this and are interested in this topic, they can follow these writers and read more.
There are many too, and it's a whole range as well. It's not like when you talk about say communism, for example, which is a very deterministic and unchanging in many cases philosophy. You say this is what history is, and it will. This Marx said this, so it will remain so, and let's follow this line, which doesn't take into account the vagaries of history and change. And it's also, for me, I kind of rejected that idea because it is not flexible enough.
Well, it's interesting because I've just finished a book about the Russian Revolution, which is always cringy to say, because like you're just saying the last opinion that you heard, but it is relevant to this discussion though, because because when they had so many famines after the revolution, you had basically the party command eating truffles and dried fruits and all these wonderful things, and they crushed their wars on 4 different fronts with officers who were in the Tsarist army and weapons that were handed down from the Tsarist army as well. So essentially, they were using the implements of the regime that they'd taken down to enforce their will on other people. But it also shows something about Lenin being someone who was so focused on getting what he wanted, he would make any accommodation possible as well. So again, that there's a deep contradiction there in that. But very good. So, okay, I really enjoyed listening to your thoughts about well, first of all, the Irish connection, and then moving along through the different elements of politics as well. Great, Lindsay. Well, for those who don't know, of course, nobody knows this except for us. I used to meet you sometimes on buses after classes. That's how we know each other. I haven't spoken to you. I haven't spoken. You looked a bit panicked there. What's he going to say about this? But so it's been very nice for me just to catch up with you again, just to talk, have a chat with you. I've always thought you were a very nice guy. It's been a pleasure learning about your other talents over today's interview. It's been a real pleasure for me. I'm sure the listeners of the podcast will really, really enjoy it. So, Lindsay, from the bottom of my heart, thank you so much for all of your contribution to today's episode.
You're too kind. You're just too kind. I have a dark side.
Don't worry, I just played up for the microphone. I'm a real bastard off the microphone.
It was good talking to you as well.
Excellent. So, just to close this up, we'll be doing more interviews with other people, and I'll be back with Maria as well for our regular broadcasts. Maria will also be doing the other interviews with me as well. So you can tune into those episodes, listeners. But for now, that's a wrap. Thank you so much, everybody, for listening. Bye-bye.